Welcome everyone to the American Club of Hamburg. Tomorrow is Election Day, a day we've all anticipated for a long, long time now. It seems like an eternity. It's only been 4 years, but since the last presidential election, that is. And here we are again on the eve of election night. And our guest tonight was with us at our annual general meeting back in February, which was our second, I think it was our last event in person, and we had him addressing the political situation at the time, which was that was the impeachment had just happened, and also the Democratic primaries were in full swing. We're just beginning, so we've invited him back. We actually had him as our first virtual speaker also in March after the lockdown, and now we have him again the night before the election. Andrew Adair. He can often be seen on German media as a commentator on politics. He spent 6 years as a practicing lawyer in Washington and worked in the House of Representatives. He publishes a weekly bilingual newsletter about the impact of Washington on the German business community on his website. At www.dc-berlin.com. Be sure to check it out and subscribe to his newsletter. And also forgot to say, Andrew, that you studied at the famed Juilliard School in New York. That's really amazing. So everyone join me in welcoming Andrew Adair. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, David. Thank you. And thanks to the American Club of Hamburg. It's great I'm dialing in from Berlin, but it's great to virtually be in Hamburg tonight.
Yeah, well, it'd be great to, if you could start off with just filling us in with what has happened in politics since our annual general meeting in February. You probably have to filter out about 99% of the things, otherwise we won't have enough time. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, thanks for having me. Great to see all of you. I guess I would first of all just start by saying that I'm sort of gearing this for a general audience who probably watches a fair amount of news, maybe doesn't consume as much news as I do, but there may also be some of you who consume as much news as I do. So I hope that I'm getting this at the right level of generality. But yeah, I mean, if you think about what's happened since February in terms of politics, I mean, the biggest thing, of course, is the pandemic, and that is the issue impacting the election more than anything. But then, of course, you have the economic crisis caused by the pandemic. You have the killing of George Floyd, which has indelibly shaped the American politics, the American society, and will continue to do so. And then inside that whole sort of landscape, you have the primaries. And so when I was with you last, it had just been the Iowa caucuses, which was Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders. I think people at the time, we all kind of thought Biden was, we kind of left him for dead. And actually, you mentioned my newsletter. Thanks for mentioning that, David. I was, I know it's easy to say in retrospect, but I was writing sort of a preview of 2020 that I intended to publish that I never did. But I basically said, Joe Biden will be the Democratic nominee and ultimately the president. And when it came to, we got the Iowa caucuses in Nevada, I was like, gosh, thank God I didn't publish that, because man, I was way off in terms of thinking that Biden would be the next president. But of course, here we are. And I think that's, we kind of, there's so much in the news cycle, we sometimes overlook how noteworthy it is that Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee. I think, there's a couple of things at play there, but the things that stand out to me are, number one, you have the Jim Clyburn endorsement, Congressman Clyburn from South Carolina, who is the House Majority Whip, and his political power, the way he mobilized his base of support, which is predominantly African-American voters, a very big voting bloc in the Democratic Party in South Carolina, to push Biden over the edge. So that's huge. I mean, if Biden becomes president, it looks like he probably will. I think, Jim Clyburn is a major cause, gets a lot of credit for that. That's number one. And then number two is that, the Democratic Party, if you look at how they rallied around Biden, once it became clear that Biden was the nominee in waiting, it seems pretty clear that they wanted to avoid what happened to the Republicans in 2016. So what happened in 2016 is they got Donald Trump as their nominee. However, the party wasn't behind that, right? The party wanted Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or even Ted Cruz. So, but what happened was, because they couldn't coalesce around an alternative to Trump, Trump ended up knocking them all down one by one and became the nominee and, of course, the president. So they didn't want that to happen with Bernie Sanders. I think the sort of the consensus within the party was that Bernie couldn't beat Trump, or that they could have sort of a similar issue on their hands in terms of the party kind of lurching so far to the left that it would get to a place that they didn't want it to. So they coalesced behind Joe Biden. So what you saw was Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, ultimately Elizabeth Warren. They dropped out, and then they all coalesced behind Joe Biden in a very unambiguous way. So those are sort of the big things that have happened since we last met.
That's interesting you mentioned the Jim Clyburn, because that was up until that point, Bernie Sanders was leading in the opening primaries, and I think it was pretty much that's what drove the stake into the heart of the Sanders campaign, right?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I have to tell you that, this is, I haven't been around politics as long as some people. I mean, as you mentioned, I worked in the House, and I started working in the House in 2011, so going on 10 years ago. And, maybe I'm a little, this is my own naivety or learning process, but I didn't fully realize how much of sort of a player Jim Clyburn was until this year, until this political moment, essentially. If you look at other, the House is a big place, it's 435 members. If you look at other people who are jockeying for leadership, jockeying for TV time, jockeying for, committee positions, Clyburn is very much in the background if you're working in the House. That was my perspective. So to see him be able to pull those strings, to mobilize his support, and to see how much people were looking to him for that endorsement, I think spoke volumes about his influence.
So maybe it would be good for you to just, if you can lay out what the two candidates are running on right now.
Yeah. So it's funny. If you think back to I'm just off the top of my head, 2000, Bush versus Gore. There were a lot of people at the time saying, well, the candidates are so similar. Why bother voting? And so I think we have we've never had a greater contrast, really, in my opinion, than we do now in terms of what the candidates stand for. But I work for a House Democrat. That's a matter of public record. So I'm not gonna hide that. My personal support is with Joe Biden. I voted for Biden and Harris. But what Biden's running on is, if you look at his rollout of his campaign last year, he has this line, restoring the soul of America. He says that the Charlottesville incident in 2017, and particularly Trump's reaction to the Charlottesville incident with the famous both sides remark, was what inspired him to run. So, he's really running on, in addition to sort of the policy stuff, he's really running on this idea of decency, dignity, ethics, again, restoring the soul of America. He talks a lot about wanting to govern for the entire country. That's a line that he comes back to a lot, saying things like, I will govern for those who voted for me and for those who didn't vote for me. A contrast to Trump, of course, who famously focuses on his base and not on those who he doesn't perceive as his constituents. Biden is focused on now, of course, on pandemic management, talks a lot about following the science, following the experts. in one of his great strengths, I think, as a candidate is his, he's been vetted over so many decades, being in the Senate, being in public life. He doesn't really have any skeletons in his closet, so to speak. I mean, there was a little bit of a sense that he got like handsy with women, and but that really hasn't been an issue. There's this, what I would call a manufactured scandal about his son, and I don't really want to get too much into that, but that is they've tried to make that into a sort of an October surprise, but he doesn't really have any skeletons. His sort of weaknesses, I would say, are his age. If he's elected, he will be the oldest American president in history. And, he has been known to make a lot of gaffes. Some people refer to him as a gaffe machine. But that hasn't been a problem either in this election cycle mainly because of the candidate he's running against. And I think, incidentally, he was very politically astute and very wise to choose Senator Harris as his running mate. She's a great contrast in terms of her youth. I think it's often overlooked, given the amount of news around this election, that her becoming vice president is also historic. First female vice president, that alone is historic. Of course, first African American and first Asian American as well. So that's a historic pick, and I think also politically astute in terms of her ability to mobilize part of the electorate that he might not be able to. In terms of Trump, he's running on this issue he calls law and order. He's tried to capitalize on the social unrest in the wake of the George Floyd killing, some of the rioting, the looting, the Antifa, and so forth. So he wants to kind of paint Joe Biden as being in support of that, which of course he's not. Of course, the irony is all of it is happening under Trump's watch. So I think that's one of the challenges, and one of the reasons why he's behind in the polls is that he's trying to paint. Trying to scare people into voting for him and not Biden, because Biden, what will Biden bring? He'll bring rioting. He'll bring Antifa. He'll bring cancel culture, the radical left, etc. But the fact is, all that is happening while Donald Trump himself is the president. So it's just sort of cognitive dissonance in that respect. But yeah, he's got this whole sort of issue that Biden is a Trojan horse for the so-called radical left, for the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Squad, Bernie, socialism. So he's using a lot of these scare tactics. I think we all know that. The economy, which was his greatest strength in terms of the different issues, he doesn't have that now because of his pandemic management. So that's also a problem for him. And then another thing I think I would just point out is that, and this is something that's unprecedented in American politics, is that the Republican Party did not publish a party platform in August before its convention. As we all know, the conventions are generally, there's not just where the nominee is, nominated. It's also when the party goes through the platform, makes changes to the platform, and then votes on the platform. What do we stand for? What are the principles we stand for? American political parties are big organizations, and they're meant to stand for something more than just a single person. And I think in my opinion, it's a very it's a troubling sign that one of our major political parties is now saying that we don't even need a platform. We've got Trump. Trump's our guy. So it has a little bit of the feeling more of a cult of personality than a political party. So those are obviously some very big distinctions between the two candidates.
It's interesting that you said the Biden campaign is running on the sort of restoring the soul of America. It reminds me of that the John Meacham book, The Soul of America. Have you read that book?
I haven't, but I know
2
John
years
Meacham.
ago.
I've seen him interviewed a lot, and I know he's a historian.
I'm glad they picked up on his words. He's brilliant. Trump, as far as what Trump is running on, it seems to be a bit recycled. It's Make America Great Again. In fact, anything that seems to be new are pretty much things that have happened that are problems that have arisen under his watch, like law and order, and these issues that are sort of knock-on effects of failed policies. What's different on the Biden side compared to Clinton 4 years ago?
Well, yeah. So this is interesting. I mean, this is being here in Germany, and you guys on this call can maybe tell me what you think about this. But one of the things I hear a lot, and a little less in the last few months, because I think the race is pretty well baked, and the polls are giving Biden a very, very good shot of winning. But really for the better part of the last 4 years, I heard a lot, oh, he's going to win again. It's sort of this, maybe you call it a glasses half empty attitude, or a fatalism, or, presume the worst, PTSD. I mean, there's lots of different, and a lot of Democrats, frankly, I would say feel the same way. I mean, there's a lot of this sort of PTSD left over from 2016 because people were so shocked. But I guess one of the things I would say is, this race, I've always thought this, even before the pandemic kicked in, but certainly now, this race is very different from 2016. So I guess that's one of the big kind of takeaways I would say is that, I don't think we're going to be surprised on, not in the same way. I don't think we're going to be surprised with, a major polling error and a Trump victory like we were in 2016. We might be surprised in some different ways, but first of all, it's an incumbent seeking re-election. That's the first sort of structural difference. Last time it was a choice. This time it's more of a referendum. So that automatically benefits Biden if it's a referendum on Donald Trump's performance. And he has a record, of course, that people can decide for themselves whether that is something they want to sign up for again. The stability of the race, okay? So if you look at the polling averages for the last year, really, I mean, Biden has been ahead of Trump. But certainly since he's been the nominee, he's been ahead of Trump by, 8, 10, 12 points on the national level, without a lot of variation. So if you look back at 2016, there's a lot of volatility in the race. Hillary was up 10 points, then she was, up 4 points, then she was up 12 points, and it bounced around a lot. We're not seeing that this time. We're seeing a lot more stability. One of the reasons is there's fewer undecided voters. That's a key point. So if you look at, for example, there's a ton of polls. You can't take any single poll too seriously. It's better to look at the so-called polling averages. But I did think it was interesting that yesterday the Wall Street Journal NBC News poll, the final version of that came out for the election with Biden 52, Trump 44. So that's an 8-point gap nationally, and 6% undecided. Whereas in 2016, it was a 4-point gap, so much tighter, and 16% undecided. And so one of the things that people have studied is the number of undecided voters that swung for Trump at the last minute. So we don't have that this time. So Biden is comfortably ahead, much more so than Hillary Clinton. There's not really enough undecided voters to swing the election like it did last time. And we don't have, there's no more time for October surprises, but we didn't really have any of those big October surprises. I mean, the president got COVID-19, there was a Supreme Court justice, Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, there were some big news items, but there was nothing that really could swing the race. In addition, I think you have, the pollsters have gotten smarter. The media has gotten smarter. The media is not chasing every little story like they did. Like they're not chasing the Hunter laptop story. The social media has gotten smarter. Social media, Facebook, they're cutting off a lot more conspiracy theories. They're cutting off the, QAnon and stuff like that. So those are all big differences. I would also say just a couple more things on that point, David. Trump's record, right? So he has something that he's running on. He's got, if you like Republican policies, he's got tax cuts. He's got 3 justices to the Supreme Court. That's a huge deliverable if you want a conservative Supreme Court. Some achievements on the trade side with North America, with China, some Middle East peace deals. So, I mean, he does have a record to run on. However, he hasn't gotten an immigration bill through Congress. He hasn't gotten a health reform bill through Congress, including drug prices, which was one of his big promises. He's done a lot of, I would say, damage to our alliances. But the thing that people really care about, of course, is the pandemic. I mean, a lot of these other issues are relatively abstract, but everybody understands the pandemic. Everybody understands how that's impacting their lives. They know someone who has perhaps lost their lives. They know someone who's lost their job. They can't see their relative in an old folks home. I mean, there's all these ways that everybody is now impacted by this. And so that's really the single issue that's driving this and making this a much different election than 2016. And the last thing I would say, and this is really important, is that frankly, I was a little bit, I had a little bit of a blind spot on this myself on 2016, but Hillary Clinton was not a popular figure, and Joe Biden is. So Joe Biden is a much more popular figure, much more popular candidate than Hillary Clinton was, and in the right places. So he's popular in the places that he needs to win, particularly Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio. So for that reason, it's a very different race than it was in 2016.
Well, as you said, the gap is much larger this time as far as the lead for Biden is compared to Clinton, and there are many fewer undecided voters this time. So there's not that much leeway for Trump to make up the votes. But as far as the administering the election, different forms of voter suppression, or like in Texas, limiting in these huge counties that are like the size of practically Niedersachsen, to have just one drop-off box, limited by the governor, things like that, and also the Supreme Court just overruling, was it the Wisconsin case now, or about counting after the election day, things like this. What can you tell us about the difficulties, the issues in administering the election?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's such a huge story. I mean, the fact is, we're now running an election during a global pandemic, and the president, you mentioned voter suppression. I mean, the president himself floated this idea of postponing the election a few months ago. And the congressional Republicans immediately said, like, no, that's not happening. So that was sort of stopped in its tracks. But the fact is that and one of the things they said was, well, we've administered elections during the Civil War, we administered elections during previous pandemics and the Spanish flu, during World War II. We've always had an election every 4 years. This is the United States, so we're not going to postpone the election. But the fact is, it does create unique challenges. So obviously, you have much more voting by mail than ever before, and much more early voting. So we now have, I think I checked today, something like 90 million Americans have already voted as of today, and probably more as we speak now. In 2016, we had I'm checking my notes here, 128.8 million votes. So we're now already at sort of 75% of the number of total votes in 2016. And some of the projections are that it will be roughly in the mid 150 million. So that's a huge jump from 128 million last time to 150, 55, maybe even 160 million votes. So ironically, yes, it's more challenging to vote this time. There are more efforts to do voter suppression. There's a pandemic, but people are voting much more. So you have a much larger turnout. So those two things are sort of happening at the same time. And I think you have a lot of people who are saying, I won't be denied my vote. And we've seen this really since 2016. If you look at some of these sort of off-cycle special elections, and certainly the midterms last year, there's been a huge increase in voter turnout since the Trump-Clinton election. And I think one of the reasons for that is a lot of people, especially on the Democratic side, have woken up and said, holy cow, we have to vote. If we're gonna, if we sleep on this or if we stay at home, this is what we get. So there's been, I just think, a huge amount of additional awareness in that respect. So for that reason, even though there are these sort of additional challenges in voting, there's going to be a lot more turnout. But that said, yes, there are these. One of the things I would just remind the especially the German participants on this call and those who may not have lived in the United States is that the elections are administered by the individual states. So Wisconsin administers its election, Michigan administers its election, North Carolina administers its election, and those are all done under state law. So each state decides for itself how it will administer its election. Some states have vote by mail, some don't. Some have early voting, some don't. Some count their ballots as they go. Some don't start counting their ballots until election day. So there's all these different rules, and each state decides for themselves. So David, you mentioned like the Wisconsin case, for example. There were, some of these key states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, are saying, okay, as long as your ballot is postmarked on November 3rd, we will accept it, even if it arrives late. So if your ballot it comes in, say, Friday, as long as it's postmarked before election day, we'll accept it. So in some of those states, Republican officials have sued, saying that is illegal under state law, and every case is a little different. So the Supreme Court stepped in Wisconsin and said, nope, all the ballots must arrive by election day. So that was a loss for the Democratic side. However, in Pennsylvania, the opposite happened. Pennsylvania said, we will accept your ballot through the 6th of November, and the courts upheld that. In North Carolina, they're saying we'll accept the ballots till the 12th of November, and that was upheld in the courts. So you can't predict how each state will act. You can't predict how the courts will interpret the law of those states. So it's a very sort of dynamic situation. One other case that I was looking at or paying attention to was there's Texas and Harris County, which is where Houston is, had drive-through voting. Okay, why not? It's a global pandemic. Why not have a system that allows you to drive up and drop off your ballot? Just like you have drive-through COVID testing. Well, that was challenged in court, and that had they won, they would have potentially invalidated 100,000 ballots. And it's an urban area, mostly Democratic votes. So that was considered a major threat, and that, as I understand it, was thrown out by the courts. So this is going on all as we go, and it will continue to go on throughout the week, and perhaps even after Election Day. So that's just something to bear in mind.
And what would you give as a prediction for the presidential race, for the outcome of it? We have Pennsylvania sort of seems to be very key here, which way that will go. Arizona, Florida, of course, is the big one. But then the Rust Belt states in the north. How do you see it playing out? How do you see the outcome?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing is, so just doesn't hurt to review the rules. So the rule, of course, is you need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. And I did a little calculation on one of these interactive maps, and my best sort of estimate is that Biden already has about 233, give or take, votes pretty much locked in, right? We know he's going to win California, New York, et cetera. So, those votes are already more or less banked. Trump, on the other hand, only has about 125 votes banked. These are the states like the Dakotas and Idaho and Missouri, states where he's going to win. So that leaves 180 to be played with, to be decided. But Biden, with his 233, he only needs 37 votes. So that basically means he has many paths to victory, whereas Trump has, really a very narrow path. But the states that really matter the most, and this is something to watch, is, if Biden replicates Hillary's performance from 2016 and adds to it Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, he wins. And those are your so-called Rust Belt states. Biden has been pulling ahead in all those states. Wisconsin by the most, by double digits. Michigan fairly comfortable as well. Pennsylvania has tightened up a little bit in the last week or so. People are focusing a lot on Pennsylvania, but Biden is still pulling ahead there. He's from the state of Pennsylvania. He has a connection with the state, and so forth. So that's sort of one bucket of states to watch, is those three. And incidentally, rewind to 2018, to the midterm election, and all three of those states flipped, and the governors in the state house from Republican to Democrat. So in 2018, statewide election, the people already flipped those states to the Democratic side. So that sort of gives you a trend line for what to expect tomorrow. But that said, I think this is kind of something to watch. I mean, it's going to be interesting. I've never watched a presidential election from Europe. So, I mean, the timing, of course, is all messed up, right? We have to stay up till like 5 in the morning or whatever, or else wake up at 5 in the morning. But one of the things that people talk about is, so if those three states go for Biden, it's over. However, those are three of the states that we're going to have ballots trickling in, and they count fairly slowly, especially Pennsylvania, where under state law, they actually don't start counting until election day. So that creates this waiting game, which is why a lot of people are focusing on the so-called Sun Belt states: Florida, North Carolina, Arizona. Okay, so Biden also has a non-negligible lead, a little bit maybe less of a lead, but still has a lead in those three states, depending on which polls you're looking at, but as of today. And all three of those states count their ballots as they go and generally report their results on the night of election night. So unless the race is so close that they can't, it's too close to call and they have to go through other procedures, those three states will announce their results hopefully within a few hours of the polls closing. So that would be, say midnight on the East Coast, which is 6 a.m. here. So if we wake up on Wednesday and we can see that Florida has gone for Biden, North Carolina has gone for Biden, and Arizona, which is going to take a little while longer because it's in the West Coast, has gone for Biden, then we can almost be assured that Biden has won, regardless of what happens in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, because it's kind of like if you can lift 100 pounds, then you can lift 50 pounds. Like if Biden wins in Florida, then he's almost definitely going to win in those Rust Belt states as well. So that's sort of like a one thing to watch. That's sort of like your best case scenario is the election gets called on election night with a very clear, clean winner.
Before just to let everybody know, I'm going to ask a couple more questions. While I'm asking, please send me in the chat any questions that you may have, and then I can call on you afterwards. So speaking of scenarios for election night, what things should we be watching for during the big event tomorrow, the big day?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the biggest thing is this sort of whether it gets called on election night. And by the way, this is another thing that an important takeaway is that the states, remember I said before, the states administer their elections and the states also certify their results. So, who wins in Florida, that's decided by the government of Florida, where they certify the result. And that actually doesn't happen for days or even weeks after the election. But what happens is media organizations will call the election based on their, statistical analysis. So they'll say, well, based on, 60% of the precincts reporting, we're calling this Florida for Biden or Florida for Trump. And so generally speaking, in years gone by, except for 2000, of course, that was a unique case, the media organizations and statisticians and pollsters and all that will call the election for a specific candidate, and that the loser will call the winner and concede the election, right? I mean, that's what Hillary Clinton did that in 2016. The day after the election, she called Donald Trump and conceded the election. So that's generally what happens. We don't expect that to happen this time, in part because most people don't believe that Donald Trump will concede the election, even if it's clear that he's going to lose. But that's one of the reasons why, and the media organizations are going to be very careful, I think, calling the election this time. I think there's going to be a lot more hesitancy to say we're calling this state for Biden or we're calling this state for Trump. I think there's going to be a lot more holding back. But again, that's why sort of the first scenario is if it's an absolute blowout and they're able to call Florida for Biden, North Carolina for Biden, et cetera, I think we will wake up on Wednesday and we will see a winner. So that's scenario one. Scenario two is more like we have to wait a few days to get the outcome. And that's where you see, okay, maybe a couple of these states like Florida are too close to call. Maybe they have to take more time. That's when Pennsylvania becomes more critical. And that, like I said, they will take a few days to count their ballots under state law. Wisconsin, same thing. Michigan. So those states may take a few days to sort out. And that's maybe a middle intermediate scenario where we're waiting till Friday to find out who wins. And then I suppose the next scenario will be, where we do have a kind of like a Bush versus Gore scenario where, for example, Trump wins Florida, Trump wins North Carolina, but Biden wins Wisconsin and Michigan, and Pennsylvania is too close to call, and then there's litigation over Pennsylvania. So that's, but based on where the polls are, I don't see that happening. I mean, I think most of the polls have Biden ahead significantly in all the states that matter, well beyond the margin of error. So, I mean, yes, I mean, people are talking about Texas, people are talking about Georgia. The fact that you have political experts talking about Georgia, President Obama, who's, of course, Joe Biden's biggest surrogate. I think he's in Georgia today, or he was in Georgia this week. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Georgia is always been as long as I can remember, a very red state, at least since the Carter era. So I don't think we're going to see a situation where it takes weeks to call a result. However, I do think, and this is where, we get into sort of uncharted territory, I do think Trump will not concede defeat and will create a lot of, he's already doing it. He's creating a lot of doubt about the result and convincing his followers and his base that the election was stolen from him. And that will be really a test of a new test for our democracy. I mean, our democracy's gotten, I think, a stress test through the Trump presidency. And I think this will create another stress test. So if I had to predict, I think, Biden will win handily. I think it will be called, the election will be, the result will be clear, if not that night, within days, but the transition will be extremely awkward.
Now, before I hand it off to some questions from the people attending tonight, I would like to ask you, what can you tell? Everybody's focused, especially here in Germany, on the presidential race. I follow all the different races going on, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the gubernatorial races. Some of the state houses are also very interesting, as that will now, being 2020, a census year. Whoever wins the state houses, and in some states, in conjunction with the governor, they will be up for reapportioning the representatives from the 435 representatives from the House, reapportioning them based on population of the census, and also redistricting. So basically, if the Democrats take some of the states, they'll be in control of gerrymandering. What's most interesting about the other races going on? And not to mention, there are also a lot of ballot initiatives. I think there are far fewer this time because of COVID, but still like 126 ballot initiatives up. Is there anything that stands out interesting between all the different races that you want to maybe touch on? Just a couple of these.
Well, wow, as a Californian, David, I guess you have to talk about ballot initiative. In the East Coast, we don't do that. Yeah. That's such an important point, and actually, that's frankly, that's one of the reasons that I was inspired to start my own business of political consulting and political advice for German organizations. Was so I guess I'm kind of violating my own principles by focusing so much on the presidency. But really, the Congress is such an important, in the United States, Congress is a co-equal branch. Congress has, essentially, supposedly, the same amount of power as the executive branch. It's a co-equal branch of government. So congressional, and of course I worked in the House, so it's the institution that I sort of follow the most. So it's extremely important. It's also separate from the executive, unlike in the European system. So the senators and representatives answer to their constituents. They don't answer to their political party or to the president. At least they're not supposed to. I think, the thing that I'm focused on the most is Senate control. So, and the reason is, well, first of all, the House is right now controlled by the Democrats. And there's no one who thinks that will change. I mean, Donald Trump has said, "Oh, we're going to win the House back," but no one think. In fact, most people, most of the polls point to the Democrats gaining seats in the House of Representatives. So that's not really on the table. I'll touch on the redistricting in a moment because that is actually really important. But just before I leave Congress, the Senate is another extremely important issue to be followed tomorrow. And the reason is, if Biden wins and the Senate remains in Republican hands, his sort of ability to get things done is going to be much more limited. So it's one thing for Joe Biden to become the president, and let's say, all these issues that we care about, like transatlantic relations, and, he will, there'll be a new beginning in terms of how we relate to our allies, and, there'll be lots of important changes without question. But if you think about things like, healthcare legislation, and, they want to reform the election system, election protection, and, gun violence, and, police reform in the wake of the George Floyd killing. I mean, there's a bunch of these issues that the Democrats are going to want to do, and there's going to be a lot of pressure to do them. And if you think about especially coming from the more progressive side of the party, the AOCs and so forth. So if the Senate doesn't flip, a lot of that will be very, very hard, if not impossible. But if the Senate flips, the Democrat, and in order to do that, the Democrats need to win a net gain of 4 seats, then a lot of those possibilities open up. So the states that really matter here, and I'm sure a lot of you are following this as well, but Arizona, Martha McSally; North Carolina, Tom Tillis; Maine, Susan Collins; Colorado, Cory Gardner. Those are 4 incumbents who are probably the most endangered. Montana, Iowa, and then you have two in Georgia now that are actually in play. And there's a few others, but those are the ones that I think are the most, that I'm personally watching the most. And then finally, I would say, to your point, David, about gerrymandering. It's interesting. Something that I've noticed a lot of people in Germany know about is gerrymandering. I think because people see it and they think it's just so obviously unfair, right? I mean, it's sort of, you just see on the map how people draw these districts in order to give themselves this huge advantage. It just seems very undemocratic, and I suppose it is. But this really is about the way that the map is drawn for the House. So the 435 House seats, and those maps are drawn by the state legislatures. So, for example, my home state of North Carolina has 13 House members in Washington. Well, when I was working in the House, there were 9 Republicans and 4 Democrats. So clearly the state legislature was controlled by Republicans who drew that map. So the census, which is done every 10 years under the Constitution, where they count everybody and figure out where everybody is now being completed. and that will determine how the map is drawn in 2022. So that will then determine whether, basically who controls the House. At this point, I don't think anybody thinks that the Democrats are going to lose control of the House anytime soon, but it's still a very important. It only happens once every 10 years. So it's one of those things like once it passes you by, you have to wait another 10 years for it to happen. So it's really one of the things that gave Republicans the House shortly after President Obama was elected in 2010, where they won 60 House seats. And one of the reasons was because of one of the reasons they consolidated that advantage was because of this gerrymandering process. So the presidency gets a ton of attention, of course, but really, all of these different offices are on the ballot tomorrow. David, are you on mute?
Oh, I'm on mute. Okay. Now I'd like to take a question from Mehdi Asghari. He has a question for you, Andrew.
Thank you, David. Very kind of you. Andrew, thank you very much. Your talk was excellent and was wide-ranging. I've got 3 questions of you, if I may. And they're going to be brief. You mentioned Jim Clyburn, and we all know that he saved Biden's candidacy. Do we know what price was exacted for that? Clyburn he's a tough cookie. He's a whip. Therefore, what he gave Biden, I don't think it came cheaply. One doesn't imagine. Do we know, is there something in the open that what price, either program or on the personal level, he actually exacted from...
Okay, Mehdi, let's have Andrew answer. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay.
Well, interesting question. I mean, certainly politics, there is a lot of back scratching, right? There's a lot of deal making. I guess, I'm not sure if I would say that there was I'm not sure if it was quite as transactional as that. I mean, I think Jim Clyburn genuinely viewed Joe Biden as the best candidate and the one with the best shot to win. So, I mean, I think that, their interests are aligned in that respect. However, I mean, I would say this. I mean, Joe Biden, I think, no one can deny that African Americans, without the African American vote, this would be impossible. Having a Democratic president win would be impossible. Becoming the Democratic nominee would be impossible. So I think what happened was Jim Clyburn sort of showed everyone this is the power of the Black vote. If we act together, we can be the difference maker. That's what happened, of course, when Barack Obama was president as well. But, so Clyburn, I think, really brought that to life. And I guess I would say, by choosing an African-American vice presidential running mate in a way that's sort of a tip of the hat, I suppose, in one sense. And then the other thing is, Biden has also said that he will choose an African-American woman to be on the Supreme Court. I mean, he's made that promise very explicit. So, I mean, I think, it's I wouldn't look at it as a transaction, but I would say it's sort of a acknowledgement. And this is also, by the way, a voting bloc that over the years has often, some representatives of the Black community have said our votes are being taken for granted, or, you only need us on election day and then you forget about us. So, I mean, I think it's really just a sign that, the African-American vote is more important than ever and more a part of the governing coalition than ever.
Thanks. And Mehdi, just to give everybody a chance to ask questions, well, you can ask one more question. Please make it short, okay?
Okay, short question. You mentioned, I believe Florida is very close to call, and it may come to Pennsylvania, and Trump made a lot of noise about it. My quick question is, what is the likelihood that it will go to the Supreme Court now?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's hard. That's a really hard question to answer. I mean, so think back to, well, first thing I would say is, remember that the U.S. Supreme Court decides whether it's going to hear cases or not. You don't have an automatic right to have your case heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court takes very few cases. So they decide for themselves which one they're going to hear. In 2000, the litigation went to the Florida Supreme Court. And there's two ways it can get to the Supreme Court. You can start in the federal system and go all the way up, or you can start in the state system, go to the state Supreme Court, and then go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So in 2000, I went to the Florida Supreme Court. A lot of people didn't think the U.S. Supreme Court would even hear that case, and then they said they would hear the case. So it's really hard to predict what they will hear and what they won't hear. But I think there's no question that there will be litigation. And I think that's enough. I mean, Trump's already essentially said that they're going to sue, even though he isn't. We don't know that he's lost yet. So I think there's going to be litigation, and I think that's another reason why if there is a clean result in places like Florida, in North Carolina, and Arizona, in an early result, I think that will be not only good for obviously Joe Biden and the Democrats, but it'll be good for the nation and just in terms of clarity. I think that will be good.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We have a question from Bing Chen about Hunter Biden's emails. Go ahead, Bing.
Okay, yeah, hi, Andrew. Regarding Hunter's laptop and emails, just wondering how valid are these accusations of corruption? And also whether you saw read the article from Glenn Greenwald, this guy's the journalist who resigned from The Intercept over the publication of this article, and how much this laptop email thing do you think will affect Joe Biden's prospects on Tuesday night?
Well, I don't, in reverse order, I don't think it's impacting the race. I think that, first of all, I think it's pretty easy to say, well, let me say this, just, I don't fully even understand what the controversy is. I was actually talking to someone about this the other day, and they were like, well, about Hunter's laptop, like, well, what happened? What was on the, that story hasn't really cut through. And I guess the other thing is, let's suppose did something nefarious or did something really bad. Well, he's not on the ballot, right? His father's running for president. So, I don't know. I don't think, it's one thing to say, well, Hillary Clinton, the woman who's running for president, did something against the law while she was Secretary of State, or she released, communicated with foreign powers on an insecure email server or whatever it was. That's a little bit more to the core of the candidate. But in this case, there's no allegation of any wrongdoing by the candidate. So I guess that's why I don't think it's cutting through. I don't think it's we haven't seen any real impact on this.
Thanks. Eric, are you there? Eric Shambrum? I don't know if he's hearing me right now. I'll ask you the question that he posed. Are you there, Eric? No. He said, do you have anything to say about the transition of power? Do you have any prognosis about how Trump might react? And equally important, how the branches of government might react to Trump's possibly erratic behavior?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion about this. I guess my basic thinking on this is that, like I said, I don't think Donald Trump, I'm assuming he's going to lose. He might not, right? He might win, but let's assume he loses the election. Let's assume that Biden is declared the winner. I don't think Trump will concede. And by the way, the process works. It's a multi-step process, right? So election day is tomorrow. Then, as I said, the states will certify their results in the coming weeks, and then they actually appoint electors, right? It's the electoral college. So in Germany, they call them Wahlmänner, which I think is kind of a funny name. But yeah, they appoint the electors, and then those electors actually show up in Washington, D.C. on, I believe it's January the 6th. So that's a good 2 months after Election Day to literally elect the president. So it really becomes official at that point. And then the new president is sworn in on January 20th. So it's this multi-step process. So while this is all happening, of course, Donald Trump will remain the president unless and until a new president is sworn in. And that's the time when I think there could be it could be a very dangerous time. I mean, if you have the acting president saying that, well, they've stolen this election from me, and we've seen. I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but when we've seen, these sort of like Proud Boys and militia and these different actors out there, there's plenty of news coverage about this too. I saw some really good coverage on Tagesschau the other night here in Germany. I mean, Tagesschau has some excellent reporters in the United States, and actually, I think interestingly, I find that. German media is actually maybe more fascinated or more captivated by this topic than American media. So you see a lot of these reports about militias and stuff like that. Anyway, those guys are out there, right? And if enough people, during the first debate, Donald Trump was asked to, condemn these groups, and he said, stand by, stand back, stand by, which of course they all interpreted as, oh, he's not condemning us. He's basically telling us to stand by. That's just be ready for action. So yeah, there could be some like legit political violence. I mean, and just looking at the news, I mean, they're boarding up Washington, D.C. right now. A lot of these cities are boarding up. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable. If you think in the United States, where we have prided ourselves on a peaceful transition of power for so long, when we take it for granted, and that the fact that they're boarding up for possible violence. So, it's going to be a very dangerous time, I think, potentially. And then the actual transition itself of the government, right? You're supposed to have, the new people, I think sometimes they call them landing teams, but these sort of the new people come in and they start working with the principals. So think about Department of Commerce, Department of State, Department of Treasury, Pentagon. I mean, there will have these kind of core people from the new administration come in and start to work hand in glove with the existing administration. And that all goes on in sort of an invisible way. We never think about it. But, at the professional level, I personally would not anticipate any kind of issues. But, if you think about like the West Wing, or, there will be pockets of the Trump administration, this very high, sort of the high level political people who, they may resist any sort of transition. They might say, no, Biden people, you're not allowed in the West Wing until, no, you're not allowed. I mean, so there's a lot of things you can kind of envision. I mean, I think we can all agree that Trump is an unprecedented, his presidency is unprecedented, and, he's broken so many norms. Some people say, we never really realized how many norms, how much of the American system was norms. The American system, of course, we have a written constitution. It's a very old constitution. There's a lot of gaps, there's a lot of ambiguity in it. But a lot of the American system is norms, right? I mean, the transition of power. George Washington. It started with him. When he left the presidency. I mean, he left. A lot of people said, "No, you should become the king." And he said, "No, I'm walking away from power. I'm going back to my, estate." So, that's the way it's always been. Other than a civil war. So, it's sort of like all bets are off. I mean, it's hard to know what will happen because we've never been through a presidential transition where a president hasn't, conceded and committed himself to a peaceful transition of power. So I'm sort of rambling here, but I think it will be a very delicate time. But I guess the other thing I would say is ultimately, once a new president is sworn in, then it's over. And I don't think Donald Trump is going to stay there and be escorted out by Secret Service. I think he'll just leave, and he'll continue to argue that the election was stolen from him. But I don't think he's going to be forcibly removed from the White House. So I think it'll be an awkward transition, but I think ultimately on January 20th there'll be a new president.
So needless to say, it would not be possibly as smooth a transition of power as from Obama to Trump when they gave him the pandemic playbook.
Right. And incidentally, they say the Bush to Obama transition was also really a model transition in terms of the degree of professionalism.
Okay, we have another question. Bing, I guess he still wants to hear more about the alternative media. Bing, go ahead, ask your question.
Sure. I just want to have a follow-up. I know that the Hunter email and laptop stories now really discussed a lot on the networks and cable news, except for Fox. But on the internet, the alternative media, such as The Hill or the Jimmy Dore Show or whatever, they go all over it. So I was wondering, how much does this alternative media, how much audience does it really reach? Does American people get a good amount of the information from alternative media that maybe they do find this story to be of significant traction instead of what the network's been telling us?
Gosh, I'm not sure. I mean, I may not be qualified to answer that question. I mean, I guess I would just say, clearly through our lifetimes, we've seen a fragmentation of the media landscape, right? I mean, a generation ago, we all kind of watched the same stuff, right? I mean, that's one of the issues nowadays is, we often we can't talk to each other because we have a different factual basis, right? I mean, if you watch only Fox News and this person watches only, MSNBC, then you probably won't agree on much. So yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that, we certainly have many more choices than we ever had before. So, people can find all sorts of stuff. Frankly, I think that's one of the reasons why these I think I've made clear how I feel about this Hunter laptop story. I don't think there's really much there, but I think it's one of the reasons why a story like this can continue to break through is that we have such a fragmented media landscape, and we have, a Twitter influencer or a, YouTube influencer can single-handedly, someone like Kanye, can suddenly just turn a story into something. So, we don't have the same kind of institutional filters that we once did. So I certainly think that any story like that can get a much larger audience than it used to in the US and anywhere in Europe, same thing.
Yeah, that's hard for us to imagine here in Europe what's playing out on some of these media sources like Sinclair and what is it? One Nation? OAN, yeah. We have no idea what's being said at those. Another question here from Eric. He said, a follow-up to your take on Trump's power during the transition time. Can anybody curtail Trump's power and prevent an inappropriate action, such as sending the military to Chicago?
Well, let's see here. Why Chicago? No, don't worry about it. This is where, again, I'm at the edges of my competency, but I guess I'll take a stab at it. I mean, there are rules around this, right? I mean, governors can call in the National Guard. That's one thing we've learned, at least I've learned this summer, right? It's the governors who have that power. Governors have a lot of authority in that area. In terms of the president ordering the U.S. military to engage in, a military operation on U.S. soil. I mean, I think Eisenhower did that to integrate the schools in the 1950s. I mean, there are examples of that happening. It's highly unusual, and I think there's a lot of what's the word for it? Not stopgaps, but like there's a lot of ways that could be blocked. I mean, first of all, if the military leadership, and by the way, the military leadership has made some pretty, I think, noteworthy statements since the Lafayette Square incident. So Lafayette Square was, when there was the pepper spray in front of the White House and Trump held up the Bible, and there was the active participation of the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So after that, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said, it was this mistake that I was there. And I believe the Secretary of Defense said something similar to that, or he made some apologies he walked back some of the statements he made about turning the U.S. into a battle space or something like that. So I think that the at the Pentagon, they don't want to do that, right? I mean, they don't want to go there in sort of like high level U.S. military leadership. So I think if there's a perception that there is a unlawful order from the top, they just won't follow it. I mean, that's the first thing. And then, secondly is Congress. Congress can, if Congress is united, there's very little to stop them. Okay, so if Congress can pass legislation with a veto-proof majority, then all bets are off. Now, would Congress do that if Donald Trump during a presidential transition were to do something erratic and extreme? Not sure. I mean, the Republicans have had very few incidents where they've been willing to stand up to him. But if Congress is united, they can pretty much block anything that the president does. So that's the other thing I would say on that.
Thanks. Mady, you had another question?
Thank you, David. Thank you. Andrew, just a quick question on the future of the Republican Party, GOP. If Trump loses and loses badly, and if the control of Senate is shifted to the Democratic Party, what is the future of the GOP? Would there be a place for people like Cotton, like Lindsey Graham, or even Mitch McConnell, for instance, people who have given 100% support to Donald Trump?
That's such an interesting question, man. I mean, I've read a lot about this. There's a really interesting site that I read a lot called The Bulwark, and there's the guy who started is Charlie Sykes. Anyway, it's basically Republicans who have left the Republican Party because they can't support Trump and what they call Trumpism. So, and a lot of them talk about this, and that's why I brought it up. So this is one of the questions that they debate a lot, which is kind of what is the future of the Republican Party? And one of the things, so there's a guy named Bill Kristol who is part of this organization, and he's been in Republican politics for decades. He worked for the first President Bush, and he used to publish the Weekly Standard. So I mean, he's a very well-known conservative writer, and he had a really interesting piece recently that I'll just basically adopt and repurpose for this conversation, which is, he said there's sort of three. He looked at it as three scenarios based on the times in the last 100 years when a president has been defeated at the ballot box. So it's really only happened 3 times in the last century. Generally, Americans reelect their president. I mean, that's just sort of the trend. Usually, if you get in, you stay in, with few exceptions. So he looks at George H.W. Bush, 1992, Jimmy Carter, 1980, and Herbert Hoover in, I think it was 1932. Those are the 3. And those sort of show the different possibilities if you buy his thinking. So the first one is George H.W. Bush, right? Let's call that forced retirement, right? I mean, everybody, no one would have said George H.W. Bush isn't a, highly respected American. He had extremely high approval for foreign policy. Think about the Cold War, think about Berlin Wall, think about Iraq War, But then, it was a bad economy. Then you have Bill Clinton, then you have Ross Perot, third-party candidate. Didn't go well for him in the election. He lost. Okay, so that's sort of the lightest scenario. And no one would have thought, oh gosh, the Republican Party is doomed now. In fact, they came back 2 years later to win the House. So I mean, no one would have thought that was some sort of like generational political realignment. Okay, then go to 1980, Jimmy Carter. Defeated much more soundly at the ballot box. Ronald Reagan swept into power. It was sort of perceived as perhaps a big shift. The Democrats had really, been in power for decades, and here comes the Republicans, and then Republicans sort of run the table for a while. And okay, so that's a more dramatic example. But again, no one thought, the idea of being a Democrat is just, not viable. I mean, they regrouped, and then they came Bill Clinton, sort of was a new type of Democrat. They kind of put the sort of old-fashioned liberals to the side for a while, and so that's the second tier. And then the third tier, which I think this kind of gets to the heart of your question, is, well, Herbert Hoover. And for Americans, Herbert Hoover, if you think about Herbert Hoover, the first thing you think about is the Depression. And I think, and that's sort of what we might end up thinking about with Donald Trump, generations from now. It might be Trump, pandemic, Trump, So if the election is truly a blowout and a blue wave, and the Democrats pick up 6, 7, 8 Senate seats, and Biden wins 350 electoral votes, and et cetera, you could see a scenario where, like Herbert Hoover, Roosevelt swept into power, and then the Democrats just ran, American government for decades. The New Deal, of course, during the war, et cetera. So you could see a situation where these people like McConnell, Cotton, Lindsey Graham, there could be a complete. It might. I guess what I'm trying to say is, it might take that type of electoral blowout to cause them to conduct any kind of soul searching and think, gosh, what we've done is, this whole direction of Trump was really a big mistake. And if we don't repurpose the party and change the party, and then it's over, So we'll see. But those are sort of, I do think, though, he's right. I do think it will take an absolute wipeout for the Republican Party to change its direction.
What sort of things do you think that we can look for in next year in 2021, domestic foreign policy, maybe in the scenario where Trump continues, and in the scenario where Biden is president?
Well, yeah, great question. So start with Biden, because I think it's probably the one I've thought about more. I mean, first of all, I think if you have, here's one really interesting question, or one really interesting thing to watch, is if the Senate flips and Biden wins, there will be a lot of pressure on the Democratic Senate to eliminate what's known as the filibuster rule. And this is really in the weeds of Senate procedure, but it's really very simple. The fact is, you need 60 votes out of 100 to conduct business in the Senate under this so-called filibuster rule. And if they get rid of it, you will only need a simple majority of 51 out of 100. So if you get rid of it, obviously it's much easier to conduct business. You only need a simple majority. And so what the filibuster rule has done over time, historically, is to force the Senate to act in a bipartisan way, because it's so rare that any single party has 60 or more votes. It's very, very rare. So you generally always need at least a handful of votes from the other side to get anything done. The House of Representatives, on the other hand, totally different. Simple majority rules all. The minority has very little influence unless they can persuade the majority. But the Senate has always functioned in a different way. That's one of the reasons they call it the world's greatest deliberative body, which is probably kind of a joke now, but that's a lot of these big things have happened in the Senate over history. So if they get rid of this, which there's a lot of pressure to do, President Obama spoke at John Lewis's funeral. John Lewis being the famous civil rights leader who became a member of Congress from Georgia, who died a few months ago. I think he was in his mid 80s or so from cancer. It was just an icon of the civil rights era, really one of the last living connections to the civil rights era, Martin Luther King, et cetera. At his funeral, President Obama gave a eulogy and said, he connected it to Lewis's legacy of voting rights. So it wasn't like he was up there just saying like, oh, the Senate should change the rules, right? I mean, obviously it was done in a way that was, respectful of the occasion, but basically said, the Congress next year must fix these things regarding voter suppression, regarding, in order to carry out the legacy of John Lewis, in order to carry out the mission, the promise of, equal rights. And if the Senate stands in the way with this, he called it, I think he called it like a vestige of the Jim Crow era, because during the 50s and 60s, a lot of these Southern Democrats would block the civil rights bills using the filibuster. So he said, if they use this vestige of the Civil Rights Act, then the Senate should get rid of it. And so that was a really powerful signal, coming from Obama himself, saying like, okay, so this is also a little bit of a sidebar, but the point is that that's really something that I'm paying very close attention to next year. If that happens, it will allow the Democrats to possibly really do a massive agenda. I mean, we're talking, and I think Biden wants to do that. I think he has this sort of idea of like, I don't want to be remembered as someone's vice president. I want to be remembered as President Biden. I want to do climate. I want to do healthcare. I want to do, police reform. I want to do all these things. So if they have, if they rerun the playbook from 2009, first term of Obama's presidency, well, the Senate blocked they made it really hard. They almost didn't get the healthcare done. So, okay. So they couldn't get anything done on climate. They couldn't get, he couldn't get immigration done. Even though there's huge support in the country to reform immigration, they couldn't do gun violence. Again, huge support in the country. So it's so hard to get legislation through the Senate without massive consensus that there will be this pressure to get rid of the filibuster. And if that happens, then there could be like a really big and bold domestic policy agenda. So that's one, I guess, bucket that I'm paying close attention to. Ironically, I suppose, I mean, I talked about this earlier, if the Republicans hang on to the Senate, it's going to be really awkward. I mean, in the sense of, just imagine all these Supreme Court battles we've had, right? Over like Brett Kavanaugh and so forth. Just imagine, Biden doing something as simple as trying to get his cabinet through, a Republican Senate in January, February, March. I mean, that could be, I don't know. I mean, that could be, there could be like gridlock like we've never seen before. So that's another, I guess, thing to keep in mind. I mean, luckily there are these, in terms of legislation, there are certain like must pass type items. Like one thing just to keep on your radar, I follow this because it's part of the, the transatlantic portfolio. I know some folks on this call are paying close attention to, for example, to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I mean, like, for example, this annual defense bill that comes through Congress every year is generally very bipartisan. It's they do it every year. So that's going to be on the agenda during this so-called lame duck period, shortly after the election. So there's a lot, and that I expect the Nord Stream sanctions to pass through that. So there's a lot of these types of big bills that will continue to get done just because they're always got done. They've always been bipartisan. But in terms of like, sort of the big agenda, the societal stuff, the stuff that to sort of move the country forward, it's going to be really hard if we remain in divided government.
And there are some that say that if Trump loses, that they expect Don Jr. to come up, but then again, it's still not discounted that that Donald Trump Sr. would not try run for it again in 4 years. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean that's true. We had a president, Grover Cleveland, was elected to 2 terms non-consecutively in the 1800s. So yeah, it's been done before. It could happen again. So my personal opinion is that I don't think Trump likes being president. I think he likes being called the president. And I think he likes having all the stuff, but I don't think he really enjoys the job. So, now that he's been president, he'll have his security detail, he'll have his, he'll always be called President Trump, for the rest of his life. He'll have a lot of the things that he likes without all the stuff that he doesn't want to deal with. So what does he really like doing? Rallies, going on TV, da-da-da. So I don't know. I think he'll make a lot of noise about running for president in 2024, but I personally don't think that he will run again.
Might be an Apprentice presidential version or something, or Fantasy Island.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think, but that said, I do think, the question was asked about, turning the page. As long as he's out there, he has 90% approval rating within the Republican Party. I mean, he's still the titular, maybe not titular, but he's still the head of the party. He's still the most influential person in the party. I think his influence will still be, it will still, to do something in the Republican Party will still require his sort of endorsement, unless, like I said, unless they have this just absolute wipeout this week, which of course we'll see.
Well, we will see. It all begins tomorrow. Well, this is it's the main event, right? It's just seemed like 4 years of a lead up. Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, really quick. If everybody on this call who is an American citizen, I would just say, if you haven't voted, it depends on the state, but there's still could be a way to vote. There's this federal write-in absentee ballot. Anyway, I would just say, just a plug for voting. So for the Americans on this call who haven't voted, I would say hopefully it's not too late.
Yes, it's not too late. Go voting. Thanks so much, Andrew, for coming back to us a 3rd time. This is a record. We've never had somebody 3 times in the same year. But we might have you back again afterwards to dissect all of this, all of the results. I've posted on the chat, I've given everybody, posted several times, the link to your website. So please take a look. I've also I just posted a letter to members, which we had just sent out for post, but here's the digital version where you can click, where you can download it, and all of the links to the upcoming events are there, as well as all past events from 2020. So please download that. And but I will just say that tomorrow we will have at 8:30. We just changed the time from 8 to 8:30, so it starts at 8:30 now. There'll be a pre-election day tailgate party So everybody's welcome to join, and it'll be very informal. So it'll just sort of be a warm up, a get together, and then an hour later we will start our election day event at Bucerius, which will be online. And our Consul General, Darian Akins, who's also our honorary president, will give the opening talk at the election day event. And fellow board member Annalee McWilliams will be one of the panelists. And then 2 days after the election, with the Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt Foundation and the Europa College Hamburg and the University of Hamburg, I will be on a panel with 3 other panelists, and we will discuss the 2 days after the election. And then on November 25th, just as a break from politics, which we try to do in between, we will have BBC contributor Joe Bauer. I don't know if you know him, Andrew. He also lives in Berlin. He wrote an interesting story that just caught my eye over the summer. It was called "Why is Germany so orderly?" So it's a bit of a sort of a modern day Mark Twain-ish writing style that he has, and I just posted that also on the chat. You can even with the link as well to the story on BBC, and he will be with us on November 25th. The Zoom link is also in the chat and in the letter. So hope to see you all again here at the American Club of Hamburg. Thanks so much, Andrew Adair, for coming. And back to us. If everybody wants to just unmute for a moment and say something nice to Andrew, and wish you well for staying awake during all of the late night elections for your first election in Germany. We've been through it all several times. We've actually been on the set of ARD Maischberger Schonenborn set with 50 American Club guests for each election. Each of the last 3 elections, and this time's the exception because of COVID.
Oh yeah,
so we'll be all doing virtually.
Because it is right there in Hamburg, right?
Well, when Obama won the first time, that was hosted by NDR. It was here. We had a big election night party at Bucerius. We had several thousand people there, and then 4 years later, which was when Obama won re-election, that was held in Berlin. So it's just rotating. It was Berlin, Brandenburg was in charge of it then. And then 4 years ago, it was WDR when Trump won. We were in Cologne on set. So we've always traveled to be live on set. So it's always been a big event for us. So the disappointment that we can't do that again this year. But we're doing it virtually. We're all coping and staying healthy and safe, and wishing that hoping that all of you stay safe and healthy. And well, it's very exciting. It's finally here, and looking forward to tomorrow, Election Day.
Thank you,
everybody.
David.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Andrew.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Go and
Good to see you, everyone.